It's a pleasure to be here. I gave a speech at Harvard Business School last year, and I got about half the turnout as I've gotten here. So clearly the environment is alive and well here in Palo Alto, but also as a consequence of this program and this lecture series that you've created. And it's really a privilege to be here, particularly since so many amazing people have participated in this series before me, including Bill Riley, who held my job before me before becoming the administrator of the EPA and then teaching here at Stanford. And it's also a pleasure to be here because we have a great friend in common, Mel Lane, who was a long-standing board member at WWF and responsible for building so much of our organization. Was so important to the life of Stanford and symbolized as much as anyone the connection between our two institutions. So I just wanted to take a moment and recognize Mel and all his many accomplishments. I hope you recognize this logo. We've spent a lot of time and effort on this logo. You can see it almost anywhere on Earth, and it's one of the most recognized logos out there. Most people who think about WWF, they think about, because of our logo, that we are nice people saving fuzzy animals. In fact, we're a lot more than that, and that's part of what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. As part of the introduction, you heard some of the stats, and there are many. We have 5,000 employees working in 100 countries with 6 million members around the world. We have an interesting structure, which someone asked me about earlier, and is a challenge to explain, but we're a global network of indigenous organizations, each one of which has its own board, each represented by one of these pandas. But we also have a long list of field offices around the world that functions as a network to solve any number of problems in the world. What started as a simple mission of saving animal species has morphed into looking at broad landscapes, dealing with market forces, looking at the economics, the science, and the politics of conservation around the world. Our work has evolved from individual species to thinking about vast systems of fisheries, working on trade negotiations between countries, and working on forests. We have some of the largest forest conservation projects in the world encompassing the Congo, the Borneo, which is pictured here, and the Amazon, where we are well on our way toward meeting goals we've established with the government of Brazil to create a new system of protected areas larger than the state of California. Imagine that. And for nearly 5 decades, we brought the best available science, economics to think about people's livelihoods in these places. And all the places we work in, none of them are pristine. They're all full of people, and we have to think as much about people's livelihoods as we have to think about the biodiversity that's there. And increasingly, we're thinking about people, their actions, their needs in these landscapes, and we're also thinking about the consequences of people, including businesses and how they affect the earth. My background is not terribly typical for a conservationist, much less for a leader of a conservation group. All of my predecessors, Russ Train, Bill Riley, and Catherine Fuller, were lawyers. Almost all of my peers who lead other environmental groups are lawyers. And that reflects the long tradition in the environmental movement of relying on government and regulation to solve problems that beset our planet. My own credentials, holding an MBA from the Stanford of the East, and an early career in marketing and product development with some very large companies, is highly non-traditional, and for some traditional environmentalists would make me the devil incarnate. But from the very beginning, my vision of saving the planet held that you not only need to work with communities and governments, you also need to think about the forces that are sweeping the planet, driven largely by business, and the realization that we will likely fail if we don't succeed in changing the behavior of business and how it touches on the places that we care about so much. We used to worry about getting people's attention, or at least keeping their attention. And any of you who have read Business Week this week will see stories of businesses that make a commitment to do the right thing environmentally, make some initial steps, and then under pressure of the bottom line, start to see those steps fade away unless regulation demands otherwise. I now worry less than I used to about getting people's attention and holding people's attention because the facts, at least to me, are clear. And this is my thesis. In the 21st century, climate change and increased scarcity of resources will likely be one of the most disruptive forces in business since the Industrial Revolution, rivaling globalization and the information revolution as a vehicle for sweeping change across sectors. Or as Thomas Friedman wrote in a recent New York Times column, quote, "This is our crucible moment." This is the time when our actions will determine whether or not our oceans will continue to produce fish that feed 1 billion people around the world, whether our aquifers will provide water to drink in farming or manufacturing, whether our forests will provide us with timber and mitigate climate change, whether our climate will remain stable enough to avoid catastrophe, extreme weather events, and destabilization, and whether or not our children will grow up in a world in which places like the Serengeti, the Amazon, and the Congo support species like lions and tigers and bears and whales and pandas. This is the dawn of the age of uncertainty and scarcity. And I'm not talking about corporate earnings and investments, but about natural resource destruction and climate change. Companies that are still thinking about the environment as social responsibility rather than a business imperative are living in the dark ages and risking the long-term sustainability of their business model. So here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. The world is finally waking up to the fact that our lifestyle is literally pulling apart the world at its seams and threatening the fabric of the planet that we inhabit. Every 2 years, WWF produces a report called the Living Planet Report that calculates the footprint of humanity on the planet and compares that to the carrying capacity of the planet. Our estimates is that the current demand for the Earth's resources are about 1.25 times what the planet can sustain over the long haul. That doesn't take into account the enormous emerging economic superpowers like China and India. And our experts estimate that if China simply catches up to U.S. standards of consumption, that this ratio will increase to 2, that we will require 2 planets to sustain our livelihoods over the long run. And if the rest of the world catches up to us, it will require 11. We don't have 11 planets. People think of traditional environmentalists as Chicken Little, running around, screaming about the sky is falling, but even the most conservative scientific bodies are agreeing on these facts. Several Stanford professors were part of a scientific article that appeared last fall that projected that all of the world's major fisheries will be gone by the year 2048 at current rates of consumption. We're losing forests at the rate of a little more than an acre per second. Most people don't know it, but deforestation and land degradation contribute about 20% of all CO2 emissions on Earth. Brazil and Indonesia are listed among the top 5 emitters of greenhouse gases, not because of cars, not because of energy, but because of cutting down trees and burning the lands that remain. Chronic water shortages now affect huge areas of Africa. UN experts estimate that 20 million people in the Horn of Africa are at risk of starvation. Even Atlanta, Georgia, my hometown, is estimated to only have about 90 days of water left if rains don't come. And then comes climate change. There's so many models that have been developed about the future of the planet. many of which predicted that by the year 2050, the middle of this century, we might see a collapse of the permanent sea ice in the Arctic. Well, a funny thing happened this past August, which is those things that people expected might happen at the turn of the century have come to pass already. And our climate change scientists worry that we may have already reached a tipping point on some of these issues. Within the next 100 years, according to a 2007 report from the UN Climate Committee, global warming will have serious repercussions, not just for people, but for animal and plant species, for businesses, industries, and government. Increasing extreme and unpredictable weather patterns will bring drought to some parts of the world, floods to others, disrupting transportation, trade, and commerce. The Stern Review on Economics of Climate Change, commissioned by the British government and released last year, estimated that the impacts associated with climate change approach something in the order of 5 to 20% of global GDP annually, and estimated the costs of offsetting climate change, or at least halting the more extreme effects, would cost about 1% of GDP. I was pleased to see the notice of this lecture on page 2 of the Stanford report, and did not mind being bumped from the front page by the news last week of the Nobel Peace Prize. And really an extraordinary event that the Peace Prize would be awarded to the IPCC and Al Gore. And in my mind, recognition of the fact that climate change is one of the great destabilizing forces of our era. The continuing crisis in Darfur, for example, has its roots in disputes over chronic water shortages. Mineral resources figure prominently in the conflicts of Congo, not related to climate change, but emblematic of the fact that natural resource and natural resource scarcity will become more and more of an issue among the poorest people on the planet, and we will begin to see more and more wars fought over water, minerals, and other scarce resources. The math is pretty simple. Over the next 40 years or so, the world's population is estimated to jump from 6 to 9 billion people, and in some places, consumption is growing even faster. Something will have to give. And personally, I'd rather look for innovative solutions and efficiency than see the destruction of many of the most productive ecosystems upon which we depend. These are the events and trends that keep business leaders awake at night as they ponder the implications for their supply chains, their customer and employee base, their distribution channels. The impacts of climate change and resource scarcity are real, and we are the generation that will decide the fate of the planet. The question we face today is how we will adapt, not just survive, but prosper. Many have long thought that NGOs offer the answer, or at least the World Bank, because of the influence and money it brings to the developing world in addressing the needs of poverty and conservation. If you simply follow the money, you can see from this chart that NGOs and the World Bank provide only a drop in the bucket compared to the increasing, growing global flows of private capital to these parts of the world. It's clear that influencing that next to last bar is where the answer is, and China is catching up fast. You don't need a crystal ball to see the future. You just have to look at China these days. With a growth rate 4 times that of the U.S., China consumes more resources globally for virtually everything but oil and timber. Although China is barely across the threshold of its ultimate economic destiny, it's already an environmental disaster. 75% of water from urban rivers is unfit to drink. 30% of the water nationally cannot be used in agriculture or industry. Because of its high coal consumption, China has 16 of the 20 most polluted cities on Earth. Pollution in Beijing is 6 times higher than New York City. Foreign Affairs magazine reports that environmental degradation and pollution cost the Chinese economy between 8% and 12% of its annual GDP when you consider the impacts on agriculture, industrial output, public health, and weather disasters. And the geographic distance between the U.S. and China provides less of a buffer than you'd think. The EPA estimates that on some days, 25% of the particulates in the atmosphere in Los Angeles originate in China. Only 7% of China's land is arable. And the country's explosive demand for resources like timber, metals, agricultural products pose less of a threat to China than it does to the ecosystems of other developing nations in Asia and Africa and Latin America. Ironically, at WWF, we've realized that if we want to save the Amazon, we need to head to China. The consumption of pork is growing so rapidly in China that it outstrips its ability to grow pig feed domestically. So China has begun acquiring the raw commodities for pig feed from other places, in particular soy. Places like this were once magnificent forests, but have now been cleared to grow soy for Chinese pigs. This is taken at the southeastern edge of the Amazon. The point is not to single out China, but to demonstrate that the world's ecosystems are interconnected, interdependent, and solving climate change and resource scarcity is not easy, with issues that cross political and economic boundaries. Instead of pointing fingers at countries like China and India, the better choice is to help them invest in technologies and practices that will reduce their respective footprints on Earth, particularly at a time when they are making capital investments that will last for many decades. The world is truly flat, and the way that any business buys and sells products inevitably has repercussions around the world. But one only has to hold a mirror up to the United States to see that we don't offer China a great model to follow. Our use of forest and timber resources outstrips every country on Earth, and this is not adjusted on a per capita basis. So the developed world is going to have a difficult time telling the developing world that they won't be allowed to enjoy the same fruits of economic success and higher standards of living as the U.S. and Europe have enjoyed for so long. John Holdren, from Woods Hole Institute, and a leading scientist on climate change, talks about the fact that we have three basic options for facing climate change. One is mitigating our emissions. The second is adapting to the reality of climate change. And the third is suffering. And the question is, what mix will we choose for the future of our planet? I contend that the business issue of the 21st century is going to be the environment. Climate change and resource scarcity and the impact it will have on a company's security of supply chain, license to operate in the developing world, brand and reputation, access to new markets, and comparative advantage in a changing environment. With major corporations now sourcing raw materials, conducting business throughout the world, the connection between various industries, countries, governments, cultures, communities, and individual lives has become much more complex and intertwined. For a start, individuals and businesses are starting to take a closer look at their environmental footprint. And for many companies, that analysis is taking them places they weren't expecting. Let us consider for a moment a simple cup of latte. As we all know, the latte is more than just a hot beverage, and much more than a much yearned for magical beginning to my everyday. It is comprised of coffee, milk, sugar, water, a paper cup, a lid, a wrapper, and the energy it takes to make the coffee. The liquid itself, one would think, would only represent about a cup of water. But if we want to think about Starbucks' footprint, we must also think about the amount of water needed to grow the sugar cane to make the sugar, to process the milk, to harvest the coffee, as well as the water used to manufacture the lid, to make the cup, and to produce the wrapper. There are lots of parts to this. And as a company begins to take this apart and look at the actual numbers, the amount of water it takes to produce a simple cup of latte adds up to 208 liters per cup. So, if you plan to drink one, you better be thirsty and prepared to deal with the impact of all that water use and the consequences to the environment. And that's just the water. If we get serious about measuring the total carbon footprint of each cup of caffeine, we also need to consider the energy to transport the raw materials, the electricity to grind the beans, brew the coffee, power the lights, the Wi-Fi internet connectivity in every Starbucks, and the gasoline burn getting you and the employees to the store itself. You can do the numbers for any bottle of Coke as well. And the numbers are staggering. All said and done, it takes about 250 liters of water to produce a liter of Coke. And the message for companies is that it is no longer enough to only take into consideration your own business operations when it comes to thinking about your organization's impact on the environment. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, your supply chain will ultimately include products from all the way around the world. And whether we're talking about fabric made in China, soybeans grown in the Amazon, palm oil harvested in Indonesia, biofuels created in Africa, companies will have to know how the products and the raw materials they use in their operations are affecting places, people, biodiversity, and the environment. There are many solid business reasons why sustainability is no longer just a nice thing to do. But more than that, it's becoming a business imperative. In the Sarbanes-Oxley era, companies must disclose any and all potential risks to their operations, including impacts related to climate change. Companies will be expected to provide detailed information about their record in respect to energy efficiency, emissions, reductions, and each must fully understand its own unique risk and exposures. The smartest, most strategically focused companies have already figured this out. They've calculated the climate and natural resource risks. They're now trying to figure out how to translate those into strategic opportunities that benefit their businesses and not, incidentally, the world. Because true business visionaries know that if their business practices aren't sustainable long-term, then their businesses aren't either. As the Harvard Business Review said in a recent article, the effects of climate on companies' operations are now so tangible and certain that the issue is best addressed with the tools of a strategist, not a philanthropist. At WWF, we work with forward-looking corporations like Walmart, Coke, and IKEA. The companies aren't just looking at next quarter or next year or even 5 years from now. They're looking far into the future of their business model, 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And one of the greatest long-term threats they see is the availability of natural resources to sustain their business. Ask Neville Isdell, the chairman of Coca-Cola, what his biggest challenge would be in the future and what keeps him awake at night, and he'll say water. Over at Walmart, CEO Lee Scott is thinking about where he will source the fish to supply his millions of customers when the oceans are fish clean. And leaders at IKEA are wondering where they will source the raw materials for their furniture 20 years from now. Even companies that don't accept climate change as a concern to their actual business operations are coming to understand that it can pose a risk and a threat to their reputation, brand equity, and even market cap. Companies that appear unwilling to take necessary measures will be held accountable by customers, employees, business partners, and increasingly financial markets. Brand value now accounts for a growing percentage of a corporation's market value. Consider Coke, whose brand is valued at $67 billion. That represents fully half of Coca-Cola's market value. And the numbers are similar for many other major consumer brands. Being perceived as a company that is doing the right thing helps to build a positive brand image and market share by attracting customers. But beyond brand and image, financial analysts are recognizing that climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and resource use have real cost and risk implications for business. A number of funds are beginning to screen companies based on these issues. And in one recently widely reported example, Citigroup downgraded coal stocks across the board, saying that their productivity and margins were, quote, likely to be structurally impaired by new regulatory mandates applied to a group perceived as landscape disfiguring global warming bad guys, unquote. This is a new era for companies. The purchase of carbon offsets was once seen as a way of companies to mitigate their emissions, but now widely viewed with skepticism. Biofuels, once hailed as the great solution to climate change, are also fraught with difficulties. Some forms require as much energy to produce as they claim to save. Others, in their production, begin to destroy forests and release CO2 emissions as a consequence. Companies need to know how to deal with this issue. Increasingly, they're turning to NGOs and scientists for guidance, not as enemies, but as key assets of expertise and connections to civil society. Other companies see great business opportunities as a result of these changes. And to be sure, that's an important part of the markets that drive part of the solution to the problem. I want to be clear that we're not advocating business activities that exploit environmental change as we're seeing in the Arctic. It is very likely that the permanent sea ice in the Arctic will disappear, opening up the Northwest Passage, and we will see more and more companies and countries begin a great grab for the resources contained therein. We're not advocating that, but I am convinced that the future belongs to companies that recognize the reality of resource scarcity and climate change and move to create products, advance innovation, and invest in technology that makes them more efficient and produces the products the world needs to create a more sustainable future. We know technology is not a panacea for climate change. It can't occur without regulations that commit countries to cap their emissions and reduce them over time. But the inherent efficiency of green products carries its own advantages. It was Tom Friedman who wrote, "You can't make a product greener without making it smarter and more in demand and more efficient, whether it's a refrigerator or a microchip." And just as a business with too much overhead can't operate efficiently and remain competitive, companies that waste natural resources or produce excess emissions are incurring unnecessary costs. And in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, those costs will go up as the world puts a price on carbon. So what is the role that WWF and other environmental groups are going to play in harnessing the power of the markets to save the Earth? A lot of people view us as a classic blue-chip environmental group, but we actually can occasionally be radical in comparison to the historical NGO model. Instead of fighting business, we're working to get markets to move in the right direction. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to create incentives for the right financial behavior, understanding how to influence purchase decisions, how to direct and influence flows of capital. There's a huge amount of capital out there chasing green technology, clean technology, and there's also a lot of misinformation about what's real and what's not. It's a big world out there, and at the end of the day, we know we will achieve the most good if we focus our efforts in a strategic way. Whether an individual spends a dollar for a bottle of water or a company spends $10 million on water irrigation equipment, it's the billions of individual buying decisions and the behavior of people like the individual for whom this lecture series is named that will determine whether or not we are able to avoid climate change and able to save the resources upon which this planet depends. But if you're an NGO like WWF and you don't have the marketing reach or budget of a company like Walmart and Coca-Cola, you have to think about where's your point of intervention? Where are you going to make the difference? Are you going to persuade 3 billion shoppers? Are you going to engage with 1 billion farmers, fishers, and foresters? Or are you going to influence the 300 to 500 companies that control 70% of the choice that consumers make? It's a bit of a leading question. We've decided that the right point of entry is to engage the biggest companies on Earth, the buying patterns that they engage in, their supply chains, and the choices they offer customers, because it's the source of our greatest leverage. When Walmart, the largest purchaser of fish in the world, says it will only buy product for sustainable fisheries, it sends shockwaves through the fishing industry. When IKEA says it will only build furniture from wood from sustainable forests, it creates enormous demand to make sustainable wood products and have suppliers scrambling to make the grade. by creating programs that certify those kind of practices, as WWF did with the Forest Stewardship Council or with the Marine Stewardship Council, and then by working to create networks of buyers and producers around the world, we're working to tip these kind of markets. Because we know if we don't help tip these markets, the markets will disappear. In terms of economic incentives for sustainable business practices, we also support cap and trade programs which are designed to achieve reductions in the emissions of pollutants. And already there are many active trading programs on sulfur dioxide and also in Europe. We're hoping in the U.S. that legislation will arrive in the next 2 years that brings about the same kind of structure. Now finally, as we think about the economics of conservation, I have to make a plug for this particular partnership we have with Stanford, Gretchen Daly, and the Nature Conservancy to think about the value of intact ecosystems around the world. Coral reefs, in addition to their stunning beauty and magic, also happen to be fish farms and play an incredibly important role in feeding 1 billion people around the world. Forests like the Amazon, in addition to hosting jaguars and an incredible array of birds, also play a critical role in mitigating global climate change. This partnership, the Natural Capital Partnership, is all about taking the best available science and influencing policies and regulations that begin to place an economic value on forests and coral reef ecosystems around the world, and then to begin to create payment schemes to keep those places intact. I want to leave with some final thoughts. Many of you will leave Stanford Business School and go on to lives of fame and fortune. No matter what business you're in, you will need to think about your products and how they relate to resource scarcity, climate change. I'm reminded of our annual Board of Directors dinner this past week when we had both Neville Isdell, the chairman of Coca-Cola, who is pictured here, and Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary and previously chairman of Goldman Sachs. And we had the most interesting conversation. One of these individuals was talking about moving his corporation toward being a leader in water conservation as a way of protecting his business. And the other reflected in his previous life how he was moving his organization toward exploiting new market opportunities that arise through resource scarcity and climate change. But both of them lit up when they talked about what it meant to lead an organization that was truly enlightened in thinking about the products and the markets it exploited and how that related to recruitment of people like you. They both talked enthusiastically about what a difference it made in attracting the best and the brightest if their company was about more than just simple products, profit, and market share, and was also about being good stewards of the planet, whether it was combating poverty, addressing climate change, or saving water resources for people around the world. As I think about your future careers and the examples of Hank Paulson and Neville Isdell, I also can't help but think that the issue goes far deeper. If you meet either one of these individuals, you realize that, sure, the environment makes sense for their business model, the business imperatives that I've mentioned throughout this talk, but both individuals speak with great personal conviction and passion about the world, about their role in the world, and about their leadership roles in doing something about poverty and the environment. Surely you will need to act to create sustainable business models that take into account resource scarcity and climate change in this century. But if you're like these two individuals, you will also likely reflect on your own personal legacy, the mark you leave on the world. My hope is that you choose to follow their example and that of many others and build businesses and markets that help solve these problems, not just for the benefit of nature, but also ourselves. Thank you very much. Do we have time for Q&A? Yes.
Hi there. In terms of objective data about trade-offs, who is going to be the steward of that? I'm just going to give an extreme example. If we decide that filling Lake Superior with algae to make biodiesel is a better alternative to continuing to burn oil or to making the entire island of Borneo a palm forest for palm oil, who is that going to be? The World Bank, the WWF, individual governments? Trade-offs, I figure, are going to have to be made, and who can give objective data and avoid the spin that otherwise companies will engage in?
Thanks for the fat pitch. What you painted is the great challenge facing us, and surely it's going to be largely governments and civil society in each country, and that's where the rubber meets the road. This past August, I was in Borneo, in the state of Sabah, where we had a chance not only to see these amazing forests, but also to see palm oil just coming in from the coast and coming over every hill and dale and covering the island. And I mentioned driving through these monocultures, just endless palm oil plantations, to a business leader in Sabah, which is a state of Malaysia. And he said, "Don't complain to me about palm oil. It's only 20% of our land mass, and it delivers 50% of our government revenues." And then he went on to explain his vision of balance between parks, working forests, palm oil, and this complex calculus of balancing all of those different needs and the economic consequences for the people of Sabah. Which in the context of Sabah is, one can imagine making those trade-offs. It's when you consider the global commons and issues like fisheries or climate change, where international agreements and negotiations are absolutely intrinsic and essential. And that's where international businesses, international networks like WWF, and other international bodies have an important role to play. And that's where the real trade-offs are going to get interesting, is how do you devise a climate change treaty post-Kyoto that brings the U.S. and China and India on board and delivers real binding commitments to reduce CO2 emissions. The imperative is there that we've got to make these commitments, but the political it's going to be less about science and more about political negotiations, and the recognition by world leaders that we've all got to meet each other halfway to reach an agreement that's going to work. But there are people dumping iron ore into the oceans to grow CO2 sequestering factories, and there are all kinds of other schemes that are out there, and we're going to have to really balance off the trade-off between the different impacts that they have and the different benefits they have. Yes, there in the back.
Hi. It seems like you already have a couple of very productive partnerships with different companies. I'm curious how those partnerships were initiated. Did they seek you out? Did you go to them and convince them that these issues are important? And how do you plan to expand your partnerships in the future?
Our strategic plan for WWF is to focus on 20 big places around the world, places like the Amazon, Borneo, the Arctic, that are important biologically but also for people. And in each one of those places, we've mapped out what are the biggest threats to that place. Some are local, but some relate to these global forces. What we've tried to do in each place is identify who are the bellwether companies in each of those global forces, whether it's palm oil or soy or financing infrastructure, and approach those companies and try to work with them in a constructive way to reduce their footprint. But some of these are just purely accidental. The Coca-Cola companies began to work with us in the southeastern United States because it's their backyard. They care about water. It was a nice, friendly, philanthropic tie-in. And then a funny thing happened, which is a aquifer in India suddenly went dry in a place called Kerala, and Coke was blamed for it. It hit the national media. It became a huge concern for them in one of the biggest markets on Earth. They also began to look at their business model into the future, and one of the greatest threats was the disappearance of water in the 1,000 watersheds in which their bottling plants operate. And there began a longer conversation about becoming a leader on water, thinking about water efficiency and what it would take for them to really achieve targets that were meaningful and push the envelope in terms of water efficiency and conservation. So, and a lot of it had to do with Neville Isdell, who, as the leader of that company, believed that this was the right thing to do. So it's a combination of logic and luck, and we're not going to change all the entirety of the manufacturing sector, but our intention is to do a good enough job with strategic sectors that we provide models to others, and in some cases actually begin to tip some of these markets I've talked about. Yes.
Thanks for a really wonderful presentation. You mentioned. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. You mentioned palm oil, and from what I understand, the biggest markets for palm oil are in India and in China. And in fact, most of the investment in palm oil is not from ADM Cargill. It's not U.S. investment. It's Chinese investment. It's Malaysian investment. It's Indonesian investment. And what do you do, or where is the leverage for those companies when both the markets for palm oil don't have the same environmental ethic as customers for Starbucks, and also when when the brand's not as important, what can we do in that case? It strikes me to be a real problem in Borneo.
It's a real problem. Most of the major banks that you know of in the world have signed on to something called the Equator Principles, which set standards for their lending and investments. They don't always follow those standards, but at least they've signed on to those principles, and it's the basis of a point of engagement with them. But those funds flows that you're talking about haven't signed on to the Equator Principles, the China Development Bank, other banks in the region. And it is an enormous challenge for us. It's why we're seeking any point of leverage we can get. In Hank Paulson's Strategic Economic Dialogue with China, one of the issues on the table is illegal trade in timber products and also trade in agricultural commodities. It's why we're beginning to look at, we have a big China program. We have an office in the Forbidden City. We have a staff that's largely Chinese, but it is still, given the economic imperative in China, it's really tough to slow the train. China buys a lot of these raw products, but then it processes them and then sells them back to the United States. Actually, if you trace the flows of palm oil, they end up in a lot of the cosmetics that you use and buy from my old employer, Procter & Gamble. And one of our sense is that part of the engagement with China has to be private sector to complement government to government. And we're working on engaging business leaders to help be a part of that conversation. China's under so much scrutiny with the Olympics coming up. They're under a lot of scrutiny because of the reasons that I mentioned, and increasingly interested and open to a conversation about how they might reduce their footprint. And so we're hoping in the right way to take advantage of that and work with them. But as you might imagine, having the U.S. go to China and talk to them about their consumption patterns isn't exactly compelling. But helping provide some financing and technological resources to help make that happen does help. And in some ways, part of the dialogue has to be the U.S. or U.S. companies committing to change in purchasing patterns and challenging counterparts in China to do the same. But we're always looking for leverage in that situation, and it's tough. Yes.
An undergraduate looking to save the earth, basically. Okay. As an undergraduate looking to save the earth, like I said, I wonder what the most effective way to do that is. Do we need scientists? Do we need politicians? Do we need business leaders? What is going to be effective in trying to?
Great
I don't know if that's
question.
answerable, but sorry.
It takes me back to the beginning of this lecture when we heard about your classmate from Switzerland and what he did in his personal life. First of all, each of us individually make choices that are really important, particularly when you look at the U.S. consumption patterns and the model we set for the rest of the world. If the rest of the world is trying to catch up to us in the U.S., then we should think really carefully about the consumption patterns we're modeling for the rest of the world. So if you're saving yogurt seals or recycling cans, or you're trying to influence what your community does, that's profoundly important. One of the things I've realized, having worked in the private sector and now in the NGO sector, is that there are these individuals in every sector who can tip the balance. Al Gore is just one example. There are other people like Hank Paulson. Who would have thought that the chairman of Goldman Sachs would end up being an environmental hero on the planet? Or who would have thought that Walmart, I'm not approving of all of Walmart's practices, but on the issue of the environment, is doing some extraordinary things, largely because the Walton family deeply cares about the issue. And there are other individuals who are scientists. Look at the influence that E.O. Wilson has had, or even the IPCC is 2,000 scientists. They just won the Nobel Peace Prize and have made one of the most complex issues on Earth something that the world deeply cares about. So I don't care which path you choose, whether it's business or science or the NGO sector. The one thing I'd say is you should have the courage of your convictions. No matter what institution you find yourself in, you can always influence it. I don't care where you sit. And the other is to develop in yourself the ability to reach across sectors. In our business model, the greatest challenge and the greatest capacity challenge is individuals who are, I call them incandescent individuals. People have said I should now think about compact fluorescent individuals who have the ability to connect the dots between countries, between local communities and big corporations, between buyers and producers, but individuals who have the ability to connect the dots are the people who are going to change the earth. And I think those are the individuals who will be our salvation. So whatever you choose, be open to the other sectors that you don't occupy and think about partnerships across them. Thank you very much. Thank you.